There's also information that would be more interesting to nation states, understanding the social connections or where people are traveling, even like which cell tower you're connected to is also very useful to intelligence analysts that are tracking people.
Welcome to the CISO Signal True Cybercrime Podcast. I'm Jeremy Ladner. On this episode, AT&T, a name woven into the fabric of modern life. The whispered goodnight, the quiet pulse of connection between friends, families, colleagues, and partners, all carried across an unseen lattice of towers, signals, and trust. For more than a century, AT&T has guarded those invisible pathways, the routes our lives travel, without a second thought. But in 2024, something subtle changed, a shift in the air, a quiet bend in the current. The kind of disturbance that leaves no scorch marks, no alarms, just the sense that something once still has begun to move. Somewhere, inside the vast architecture of AT&T systems, data began to act in ways it shouldn't have. Not the words people said to one another, but the outlines, the silhouettes of conversations, patterns that reveal who speaks to who, when, and how often. Details that paint a portrait not of what we say, but of whom we are connected to. The kind of information that in the wrong hands can be far more telling than content itself. How it happened, what was taken, and what it means for every organization that stores sensitive behavioral or relational data, those are the questions we'll unravel on this episode. And to guide us through the story, we're joined by someone who knows the telecom battlefield better than most, John Carse, Field CISO at SquareX, a 3-time CISO, a veteran of securing global networks and enterprise systems, and of course the host of his own podcast, Be Fearless, the CISO Perspective. John, welcome to the CISO Signal.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for inviting me on your show. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Absolutely. And for anyone interested, I was on John's podcast not too long ago. If you haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you to go check that out. And now, let's begin the investigation. We are in the midst of a ceaseless war. Not of bombs or bullets, but of breaches, firewalls, and silent incursions. The targets? Our borders, our banks, our commerce, and the critical infrastructure that underpins a free civilization. The enemy is cloaked in code, fueled by greed, glory, and a desire for chaos. This is the story of the unseen protectors, the nameless generals, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers. They are the guardians at the gate, the watchers on the wall, ever vigilant and always listening for the CISO Signal. Act 1. The Map of Your Life. You are being watched right now, and all day and every day, tracked to be more precise. Your phone is quietly recording the patterns that make up the outlines of your life. Who you call when you wake up, who you speak to on the drive to work, which towers your phone touches as you move through the world. It logs the call you place at the end of a bad day at the office, the one the businessman makes as he rushes through an airport terminal trying to close $1 million deal before his connecting flight boards, or the number that the congresswoman dials when she needs someone to come and clean up an embarrassing mess before it becomes public. None of those moments feel remarkable at the time. They feel private, forgettable, disposable, even. As you likely already know, this information is referred to as metadata, and most people think of it as harmless, boring, technical, even. Something that lives deep inside a secure system, locked away, never to be seen. But metadata is not abstract. It is a map of human behavior, and in this story, that map belongs to tens of millions of AT&T customers, ordinary people, your neighbors, business executives, government employees, service members, anyone carrying a phone connected to one of the world's largest telecom networks.
Telecom metadata is often misunderstood, I believe. How do you explain what it reveals without getting too technical?
In the context of the AT&T breach, the metadata are things like the phone number, right, and who you called. So you got those 2 points. When the call happened, the duration of the call, right? That's another piece of that information. And all of this information is important to MNOs, to mobile network operators in particular, because we have a lot of interconnect agreements between different parties. So even though you're on AT&T and you're calling AT&T, when you go and you connect to T-Mobile, that information is being tracked. How do they know how much to charge AT&T for that interconnect agreement and how much T-Mobile has to charge for it? And then those interconnect agreements have to kind of wash out in some way.
For years, this data accumulated quietly, slowly. Call and text records retained for billing or troubleshooting. Interconnect agreements, regulatory compliance, logged automatically and stored by default. Cell site connections that left behind echoes. Rough sketches of movement, ghostly footprints tracing where lives passed through the network. And once enough time passed, the data became capable of telling a story no one ever intended to write.
Before we get into the breach itself, what was happening in the world, you think, that made telecom data such an attractive target way back in 2024?
Well, I think that telecom data is attractive to adversaries for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think there's, different kinds of adversaries that we have that have different interests in data. Some of them may be looking for information with respect to who you know so they can target you for a phishing email, right? Or they might want to steal your credentials, and having your phone number might be interesting to them. There might be access to different systems that having your phone number is useful, like SIM swapping and other kinds of attacks that allow them to get the text for one-time passwords on their phones instead of your phones.
By the mid-2020s, visibility itself had become leverage, knowing who connects to who, where they go and when, and how often they return. In a world growing louder and less predictable, maps like this stopped being theoretical and became strategic.
There's also information that would be more interesting to nation states. We're understanding the social connections between people or where people are traveling, because there's a lot of, we're going to talk about metadata later, but a lot of metadata on which cell tower you're connected to for that information. So, so understanding where you are in the world is also very useful to intelligence analysts that are tracking people there. So, there's definitely some cyber fraud and criminality aspects to it, but there's also, I think, nation state kind of intelligence gathering that's also very interesting to people.
Some criminals want quick money, others want leverage, and perched above them all are the nation states looking for something darker. Your patterns, your routines, your secret rendezvous and networks of influence. Metadata does not just show where you are, it shows what matters to you.
For the folks who aren't deep in telecom, what do you think makes AT&T such a high-value intelligence target?
Well, I think the biggest reason is the number of customers that they have, the number of relationships that are involved there.
AT&T is not just a telecom provider, it's a junction. Billions of calls pass through it, even when the people on the line are not AT&T customers. That is what makes this breach bigger than one network.
But the way that the protocols work and the way that phones work to access networks, there's a lot of call detail records and stuff that come from other companies, right? So you don't just see what you see inside AT&T. You also see the connectivity that's part of AT&T. So there's one away from AT&T when those calls happened. Now, so that gives you a little bit less context of what that person is doing, maybe with respect to, let's say if it was a T-Mobile breach, then the T-Mobile customer and for call detail records will give you more information like what those customers are doing. But when they intersect with AT&T, it's a big network. So that means that you have a lot of, primary connections and then secondary connections that are available to those other networks.
By 2024, AT&T was handling call and text metadata at a scale few organizations on Earth could match. billions of interactions spanning months and in some cases years. Before there is a breach, before there is an attacker, this is what is at stake. A population-sized record of movement, relationships, and routine, and the most dangerous part is how normal it all feels. There is no alarm when this data is created, no warning when it is stored. It simply accumulates day after day, month after month, like a vault, slowly filling with millions of secrets without anyone stopping to ask who might want them. Because in a world where data is currency, a map like this does not stay ignored forever. It becomes unguarded treasure, and unguarded treasure always attracts attention. Act 2. The malicious market for maps. If you understand the value of the map, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who would want it and why? According to public reporting and security researchers, access to AT&T's call and text metadata appears to have occurred months before the company ever disclosed it publicly. Between April and early June of 2024, attackers gained access to systems containing call detail records tied to approximately 86 million customers. Some analysts attributed the activity to a cluster they labeled UNC 5537.
If you were to zoom out to the months right before the breach, what subtle cracks or conditions typically make an incident like this possible?
When you work for a company like AT&T or really big companies, there are definitely parts of the business that are core to your value proposition that you're making to a customer. And then you have a bunch of other parts of the business that are necessary for you to operate. And if they're not core to the business, it's often cheaper for you to go to a third party and have them do work for your team. With respect to like what we're going to see in this breach, I think it has a lot to do with third party risk management and how you control vendors and suppliers and how they access your data in those systems and what they're allowed to connect to and how they connect to them. And all of those things start to matter as you make those decisions.
What made this intrusion different was not speed, it was patience. There was no outage, no systems taken offline, no public signal that anything was wrong. Just subtle activity that stayed quiet long enough to appear normal.
When metadata is moving around perhaps in ways that it shouldn't, are there any sort of early signs that something might be wrong, that you might be able to see some clues that there's some nefarious actions taking place?
I think from intelligence and operational perspective, you might see, if it was being used nefariously, right? You might see there are new kinds of connections and networks, people being added to the network. If you can imagine, John and Jeremy are on a phone call together for X amount of period of time, and we talk every day, let's say. And then all of a sudden you have someone that is joining the network, and now they're making connections to that network that were never there. You could start to see if this information was being operationalized.
This is the difference between a breach and an operation. The theft is only the beginning. The real danger starts when someone begins to work the data, turning a record of calls into a map of relationships. New links appear. Familiar numbers get pulled into new patterns. Patterns that were once just billing exhaust are now valuable intelligence.
But as a mobile network operator, the core business is not intelligence analysis. So, and then 99.999% of those calls, or maybe higher, would be just new people you met at a bar or something else. And so it would be really hard to kind of identify in the data new relationships that were nefarious, unless you started seeing like, hey, someone's reporting that this was not a call that I expected, and that was spam or something else. And
at telecom scale, the abnormal can hide inside the normal. A few new connections, a few unusual edges, buried under billions of legitimate early morning calls and late night texts.
No one's calling themselves Cozy Bear or Scattered Spider in the metadata.
Exactly. More than likely, these actors are purveyors of data. What they're doing is they're getting data and they're reselling to someone else that would use it nefariously.
In most breaches, people imagine one villain, one group, one motive, one endpoint. But the modern cybercriminal economy does not work that way. It's modular. Data is now a commodity. The people who are stealing are not always the people who are exploiting, and the people who are exploiting are not always the ones taking home the biggest payday.
So they're brokers. If you can imagine that there's like a supply chain, in very much the same way threat actors operate, where you have people that are first parties that they take the data, but then they're reselling it. And then what people do with that data could be, adding more information into it, creating better data sets that are more targeted towards folks that are involved in the fraud economy, right? And they're going to defraud someone else or make a phone call. And so they need more information about that person so that they can make it happen. There's different parts of the, I think, underground criminal dark web economy that this data would be useful for, but not necessarily something you're going to see in the data as a AT&T cybersecurity person.
Data like this rarely stays with the group that first steals it. It moves, it's resold, combined with other data sets, and then enriched. Some analysts linked the activity to criminal resale ecosystems where stolen data is brokered quietly, often through underground forums. Groups such as Shiny Hunters were mentioned in some reporting, known less for espionage and more for monetizing access at scale. Other experts, including researchers at Mandiant, urged caution. They argued the activity appeared consistent with opportunistic criminal profit, not confirmed state-sponsored intelligence work. Attribution, even now, remains uncertain.
But based on what is publicly known, what do you think was likely the most probable path that the attackers used to get inside?
I think where this kind of begins to, fall apart is on the third party, and how do you manage third parties, right? How do you vet them? How do you know that they're going to do the right things? But this particular use case was a couple of actions that I think were poor. You probably had some, I think I read that there was like some social engineering, that one of the EPAM employees was compromised via phishing exercise, or not phishing attack.
This is how a high-value breach often begins, not with a sophisticated exploit, but with a human moment, a click, a credential, a foothold. And the danger is not the first compromise. It is what that compromise can reach next, because a third-party access is built for convenience. Inconvenience is often indistinguishable from permission.
Employee then had a infostealer dropped on their machine. That infostealer, and it's a rat remote access Trojan that allowed them to move around on the company network, and they found credentials that were left in clear text and Jira tickets. That's where the credentials for the Snowflake database that had call detail records of AT&T was found, and that's what kind of precipitated the actor being able to start stealing all of those call detail records.
Investigators later traced the intrusion to a third-party cloud environment associated with AT&T's data operations, systems hosted in Snowflake, credentials that still worked, and access that looked legitimate enough to blend in.
I'm going to guess that there are some people, at least, who would be thinking to themselves, well, why did they just take the metadata? Why not the actual text messages? Why not audio from calls? Is it simply just because it's just so much easier to get the metadata, or is there some other reason that we might be missing?
I'm assuming that there would be a lot of value in having those recordings, but one of the nice things about how mobile network operators work and how we instantiate connections between phones is there's actually a bunch of protocols that are used, and they allow point-to-point encryption between two phone calls. So even if you could copy all the packets of that phone call, you probably wouldn't be able to decrypt it so that you could use it.
What is not disputed is that money entered the picture. In May of 2024, AT&T disclosed that it had paid approximately $370,000 in cryptocurrency. The payment was not made to restore the systems, it was made to suppress exposure, to stop the map from being published. There is no public evidence that this specific dataset was used for espionage, and there is also no way to prove that it was not. Once metadata like this exists outside the original environment, control is gone. permanently.
And now for this episode's quick question for CISOs and security leaders. What concerns you most about incidents like this? A, third-party risk, B, identity and credential management, or C, data governance and architectural drift. Add to the conversation with your comments below. Act 3. When the map leaves the vault.
On July 12, 2024, AT&T publicly acknowledged the breach. Customers were told that no call content or text messages had been accessed, and that reassurance was technically accurate, but by then, the nature of the damage had already shifted. The exposure was not about what people said, it was about how they lived, the patterns of their lives, being watched, being recorded, and being sold. For tens of millions of customers, the stolen data covered months of activity. Quiet calls placed during commutes, late-night conversations, repeated contacts that reveal relationships without ever naming them explicitly. In some cases, approximate location data inferred through cell tower connections. Privacy experts were quick to explain what that means in practice. Metadata can reveal business transactions, religious observance, or political organizing. Even late-night private romantic relationships. The kinds of truths people assume remain hidden because they never speak them out loud.
So let's talk about the actual, the moments of the breach, the first 24 hours right after. What do you think the inside of that SOC looked like? What do you think the inside of that war room and the C-suite and the board getting notified? Paint us a picture, if you can, of the challenges that the CISO might have been facing in those first few hours.
The first thing that happens is you want to understand if there's a valid claim here. Do they actually have your data? And that actor who's trying to extort me, he has to have proof points to say, yeah, I have your data.
This is the moment where certainty matters more than speed. Before statements, before disclosures, before anyone outside the room knows, you have to answer one question first. Is this claim real? And what proof do we actually have?
And second, informing executives. Want to let them know quickly, but at the same time, I don't want everyone to kind of go crazy until we validate that there's a problem.
When you discover and confirm that data describing people's lives has been accessed, even without the content, just the metadata, how do you frame that conversation internally?
When I start looking at the data, for one, I'm not really telling the actor too much about how important this data is to me. I would start to frame it in what kind of risks that might have a financial impact or reputational impact to the company. If we have some idea of what the volumes are, that also plays a lot into how I would be framing it to executives.
This is where language becomes strategy. Metadata is no longer a technical artifact. It becomes a business risk, a trust problem, a leadership test.
How do you suggest communicating something like this without creating unnecessary panic in the public and your customers?
As this breach is continuing, you're going to bring in some incident response team. I want to get a lawyer involved. I want to get external incident responders involved, and I want to keep it, somewhat contained legally.
By this point, the incident is no longer purely technical. It's crossed into law, into reputation and consequence. Investigators began tracing paths beyond the company itself, following the credentials, following transactions, following the same access patterns were used across dozens of other organizations touched by the same campaign. Those investigations led to arrests. One individual was apprehended by the end of the summer, and the machinery of consequence, slow and imperfect, had finally begun to turn. Later reporting linked figures such as John Aaron Binns and Connor Mocha to the broader Snowflake breach campaign, though the full scope and responsibility remained clouded in the fog of ongoing investigations.
One of those options that are available to you as an incident responder in a big company is how do you get the Justice Department, the rest of law enforcement involved to understand the size of the crime, and et cetera. So doing that allows me to put myself into a place where I can understand the attack better, what the implications of that attack is. And once I know enough details, that's when I get the media team involved, right? The media and marketing and public relations and those folks together, so that given the facts of the case, how we're going to go to the public with the information, right? That is truthful, right? For one, but also not incendiary, right? We want to be fact-based and control the narrative as best we can, so that we're not creating a huge problem with our customers.
In the months after a breach like this, what sort of security debt tends to surface?
One, you need to understand what happened, what the initial access vector is, and you're trying to build the facts and the timeline of what actually occurred. And facts are really important.
This is where hindsight begins to hurt, because the answers were always there, just not where anyone was looking.
Understanding the administrative and technical controls mean, what did we do from a third-party risk management perspective? What technical controls did we have that may have worked or may not have worked? Or if we, in this case, when we look at what happened on the EPAM system side, what do I need to change about my third-party risk management program that doesn't allow this kind of thing to happen again? Do they not have the right kind of technology on their systems to detect a rat that's been dropped on their systems? Then you get into the JIRA part, where they're storing credentials and the tickets and the ticketing system so that they can get back access to that. I think another thing that I saw in some of the write-ups was that credentials were being reused, right, between different accounts.
This is the anatomy of security debt, not one catastrophic decision, but a series of small shortcuts that survived too long. A reused password, a credential stored where it should not be, a vendor environment treated like an extension of your own, but without the same visibility. And when the breach arrives, it does not create these weaknesses, it reveals them. It shows you where operations quietly outran governance.
Whenever you're dealing with third parties, and one of the tools that I've seen abused many, many times over the last 10, 15 years has been password reuse and not being able to control access to it. There's not a lot of controls that happen on the EDR side and the network side, because you're kind of going to those systems. But when you get to third-party risk management and third-party contractors working on your system, how do you control that they're not reusing passwords, right? How do you control that they're in the context that you're expecting them to be in? And then if you can detect that kind of threat happening, right, how do you, employ it? And I think that, tools like secure browsers and our browser detection response can help you kind of start narrowing that problem.
When you see a breach like this, does it reshape threat modeling for large enterprises, in your opinion?
Absolutely. And this is the part, when we talk about incident response and the process, there's always the preparation parts of it. That's what you do when you're inside of it to contain, eradicate the threat. But after you're done with the actual incident, there's the post-mortem and understanding, again, going through the defenses, what's your administrative technical controls, what blocked, what didn't block. Well, I think that the lessons to learn from the breach are that you need to be really careful about your third parties.
What John is describing here is the moment after containment, when the technical emergency ends and the harder questions begin. Not just how the attacker got in, but why the organization was exposed in the first place. Because at this stage, incident response stops being about eradication and it becomes about judgment. Systems are often introduced to solve small operational problems. They work, they earn trust, and over time they're asked to carry more than they were originally designed to hold. The data changes faster than the oversight. The risk quietly escalates, and the organization does not always notice the moment when an operational platform becomes a repository for intelligence-grade material.
I think that the real problem on the AT&T side is, how did they calculate the risk? Was the risk calculated correctly for the kind of information that EPAM systems was going to be operating against, right? As your architecture changes, more than likely you need to reevaluate that you're using Snowflake. You said you were only going to do it for this, And now you've gone from level 1 of problems of data that you have in Snowflake. Now you've gone to level 3 or level 5 level of problems of data that you're storing in Snowflake. Because this is a real thing that happens, that what you initially use Snowflake for might be a POC just to see if it works. People get excited about it and they say, it's working for what we do. It's very performant. And then they start putting more and more systems on it. But the initial evaluation was for a non-critical system. The person that was doing the work for that non-critical system is level 1 certified, let's say. But now you're putting level 5 data in it. Did you go back and reevaluate that the data changed? Often, the kind of data that we put in changes, but the architecture may not actually change. So your architectural review boards don't know that the data has changed that you're putting into a system.
Right.
And so then you have like these kind of like just mismatches of how much risk you were willing to take with Snowflake and how much risk you're willing to take with EPAM systems. But then
that kind of reminds me of the Peter Principle. Are you familiar with the Peter Principle?
Yeah.
So great for anyone who's listening is when you say enter an organization and you're pretty good at your job, there's a good chance that you're going to get promoted. And if you're good at that job, you'll get promoted again. And eventually you'll get promoted into a role that you're no longer good at. And that's where you will stay. And that's kind of similar to this situation. Really, I guess you keep piling on the burden until the shoulders are strong, but any shoulders can only bear so much weight before they buckle. You've been at this game for decades. You are a seasoned pro with some hard-won wisdom. Is there any piece of advice that was passed down to you along the way that you might share?
I think that's one of the things that we need to be cognizant of as we kind of grow as leaders, is that what we say has a lot of weight. Don't have too many messages. You have 2 or 3 messages that you're working on. Until those 3 things are done, don't worry about adding a 4th one. Because otherwise the message gets diluted. People feel like they're not working hard enough, and your quality of life of your people starts to degrade, and you start having attrition problems like that. So I think stay focused, understand that you're carrying a lot of influence, and that what you say is mattering to people.
John, thank you so much. It was so great having you on the show. Great conversation, and I hope you come back again soon.
Thanks, Jeremy. See you on my podcast here in a few weeks.
Well, see you soon.
What happened at AT&T was not a failure of encryption. It was not a failure of uptime, and it was not a failure that announced itself with alarms or outages. It was the quiet consequence of accumulation. Months, and in some cases, years of call detail records, tens of millions of people stored for reasons that once made sense and then repurposed into something no one explicitly designed. A system built to move information efficiently became a system that described lives precisely. And once that description existed, the question was no longer whether someone would want it, only when. This breach did not expose secrets spoken out loud. It exposed patterns, habits, relationships, the invisible structure of daily life. That kind of data does not age out, it does not expire, and once it leaves its original environment, it does not come back. There is no public evidence that this data was used for espionage, but then again, there is no evidence that it was not. That uncertainty is the new reality. And this is not only AT&T's story. Every organization that logs behavior at scale now holds a map, and every map that leads to something valuable draws attention from people who want to take it. Risk does not always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it arrives as normal operation, logged quietly, stored responsibly, and ignored for just a little too long. The most unsettling part of this story is not that the breach happened, it is that it happened so quietly, and that no one can say with certainty who may still be holding copies of those maps, those patterns, those private relationships right now. And so, we must remain forever vigilant and always listening for the CISO signal. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't, thanks for listening this long. We'll see you on the next episode of the CISO Signal. All episodes are based on publicly available reports, postmortems, and expert analysis. While we've done our best to ensure accuracy, some cybersecurity incidents evolve over time and not all details have been confirmed. Our goal is to inform and entertain, not to assign blame. Where facts are unclear, we've used cautionary language, and we always welcome your corrections. Thanks for listening to the CISO Signal.